In 1902, a grain speculator from Chicago named William Bartlett paid between 30 cents and $1 an acre for 205,000 acres of northern New Mexico, a piece of ground that ran from the short grass prairie up through ponderosa forests, past timberline, and into the Sangre de Cristo peaks at nearly 13,000 feet. He bought it because his youngest son had tuberculosis, and a doctor had told him the dry mountain air might help. That was the reason. Not cattle, not timber, not minerals. A sick boy. Within 6 years, Bartlett had hired one of the most prominent architects in America to build a 25,000-square-foot stone mansion in the wilderness, shipped marble pillars from a Chicago bank by rail to the nearest depot, and employed Italian craftsmen from the local coal mines to carve mahogany for the interior. He stocked lakes with trout. He reintroduced elk to mountains where the species had been hunted to extinction. He expanded the property to 300,000 acres. And when he died there in 1918, and both of his sons died within 2 years of him, the ranch simply passed on to the next owner, and the next, and the next, each one arriving with a different vision for what this land should be, each one eventually leaving until the land had outlived them all. Today, Vermejo Park Ranch covers roughly 558,000 acres, 3/4 the size of Rhode Island, making it one of the largest contiguous pieces of privately held land in the United States. It contains 19 fishable lakes, 30 miles of stream, 6 distinct ecosystems, the ruins of 5 coal mining ghost towns, a cemetery with nearly 400 white iron crosses marking the graves of men killed in underground explosions, and a herd of bison whose genetics are so rare that scientists have traveled from across the country to study their blood. All of this sits on the same ground that was once part of the single largest private landholding in American history. The story of Vermejo is not really about any one owner or any one era. It is about what happens when a piece of earth is so large, so remote, and so rich in hidden wealth, coal, gas, timber, water, grass, game, that it becomes a kind of mirror. Every person who has held the deed has seen in it exactly what they needed to see, and every one of them has eventually been wrong about what it was. To understand how Bartlett came to own Vermejo, you have to go back 60 years to a fur trapper from Illinois named Lucien Bonaparte Maxwell. Maxwell was born in 1818 in Kaskaskia, a small town in the Illinois Territory. His grandfather had been the first lieutenant governor of the state. His great-uncle was the vicar general of Upper Louisiana. But Lucien was restless. At 17, he headed west, fell in with the mountain men, and ended up in Taos, where he met Kit Carson and went to work for a French-Canadian rancher and trader named Carlos Beaubien. Beaubien had something Maxwell wanted, not just a job, but a land grant. In 1841, the governor of New Mexico, then still part of Mexico, had awarded Beaubien and a Mexican official named Guadalupe Miranda an enormous tract of land in northeastern New Mexico and southern Colorado. The boundaries were vague. Nobody knew exactly how much land was involved. But it was big, and Beaubien needed people willing to settle it to keep the grant valid. Maxwell married Beaubien's daughter, Luz. She was 13 years old. The wedding gift, it is said, was 15,000 acres. Over the next 2 decades, Maxwell bought out every other heir and claimant, piece by piece. Miranda sold his share for $2,745. After Beaubien died in 1864, Maxwell purchased the remaining Beaubien parcels from the other 5 heirs for sums ranging from $3,000 to $6,000 apiece, a total of $35,245 for the whole thing. When the land was finally surveyed in the late 1860s, the grant was measured at 1,714,765 acres. Maxwell had acquired it all for roughly 2 cents an acre. He became, by some accounts, the largest individual landowner in the history of the United States. Think about what that means. 1.7 million acres, roughly 2,700 square miles, a territory larger than the state of Delaware. His operation at its peak ran 20,000 sheep, 1,500 cattle, and 400 horses and mules, employing an estimated 600 men, many of them under a system of peonage in which workers labored to pay off debts they could never quite extinguish. Maxwell set their wages and ran the store where they spent them. The arithmetic was always in his favor. Maxwell built a grist mill, ran a store in the town of Cimarron, and hosted travelers on the mountain branch of the Santa Fe Trail with a hospitality that became legendary. People said you could show up at his door, anyone, stranger or friend, and be fed and sheltered without question. He was generous, impulsive, and absolutely lousy with paperwork. Deals were sealed with handshakes. Titles were informal. Boundaries were approximate. Then gold was discovered on the Grant in the 1860s near Baldy Mountain, and everything changed. Miners poured in. Maxwell leased claims, charged fees, and for a time the money was extraordinary. But the influx of people, prospectors, squatters, speculators, created legal chaos that Maxwell, who had never been precise about deeds, was not equipped to manage. By 1869, he was ready to sell. He gave an option to a group of investors led by Senator Jerome Chaffee of Colorado. The deal closed in 1870 for a contract price of $1,350,000, though the generally accepted figure Maxwell actually received was closer to $600,000. He sold his Cimarron home and remaining Colfax County property for an additional $125,000 a few weeks later. Maxwell took the money and moved south to Fort Sumner, a decommissioned Army post he bought for $5,000. He remodeled the officers' quarters into a 20-room house, started ranching again, and invested in other ventures. They all failed. Within 5 years, Lucien Bonaparte Maxwell, the man who had owned more land than anyone in American history, was dead of uremic poisoning at 57, essentially penniless. His child bride, Luce, outlived him by a quarter century and was buried beside him. The land he sold passed to a newly formed corporation called the Maxwell Land Grant and Railway Company, backed by English and Dutch investors. They paid $1,350,000 for nearly 2 million acres. It sounds like a steal, and it was, but the title was a mess. The U.S. government initially ruled the grant contained only 97,000 acres under Mexican colonization law. The company fought that ruling all the way to the Supreme Court, which in 1887 affirmed the full extent of the grant. In the meantime, settlers who had been living on the land, ranchers, farmers, miners, were told they were trespassers. The result was the Colfax County War, a violent series of confrontations that dragged through the 1870s and 1880s and left several men dead. By the time the dust settled, the Maxwell Land Grant Company had clear title, but the company itself was financially shaky, its stock bouncing on the London Exchange, its vast holdings difficult to manage from Amsterdam. The company began selling. And that is how, in 1902, William H. Bartlett came to hold the deed to the Vermejo. Bartlett was a grain operator, one of the men who made fortunes in the Chicago commodity exchanges in the decades after the Civil War. He was 62 years old when he bought Vermejo, wealthy enough to do anything he pleased, and facing the prospect of watching his younger son, William Jr., die slowly of tuberculosis. The purchase was, in some ways, an act of desperation dressed up as a real estate deal. Bartlett withheld part of the last payment to the Maxwell Land Grant Company until the company had removed the remaining Mexican squatters from the property. In a letter to his cattle manager, H.W. Adams, he wrote the condition plainly. They are given 2 years to get the Mexicans off, and I hold back $10,000. Those squatters had lived along the Vermejo River for generations. They had crops, cattle, small orchards, a store, a church, a school. Adobe ruins visible today along the river from below the park area all the way down to the old coal town of Dawson are the only remaining evidence of those ranches. Bartlett cleared them and got to work building his private world. He started with a small cottage on the north side of the Vermejo River in 1903. His sons moved in almost immediately, the elder, Norman, to manage lumber operations, William Jr. to breathe the mountain air and, with luck, recover. By 1907, Bartlett was ready for something grander. He commissioned Joseph Lyman Silsby, a prominent Chicago architect who had designed Bartlett's home in Evanston, Illinois, and who is best remembered today as one of the early mentors of Frank Lloyd Wright. Silsby was known for his work in the Queen Anne and shingle styles, but for Vermejo he turned to the California Mission Revival, the same idiom the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad was using to market the Southwest as a romantic destination. The choice was deliberate. Bartlett was not building a working ranch headquarters. He was building a retreat. Between 1907 and 1909, 2 stone houses rose on the banks of the Vermejo River, Casa Minor and Casa Grande. The walls were quarried from sandstone in the surrounding hills. The roofs were red tile. Casa Grande, Bartlett's personal residence, was 25,000 square feet, a mansion by any standard, but especially startling in a landscape where the nearest town of any size was Raton, an hour's drive over rough roads. Inside, those Italian craftsmen from the nearby coal mines carved the mahogany trim. Marble pillars arrived from a dismantled Chicago bank. Silsby also designed cottages for a resident doctor, a secretary, and a superintendent, and expanded Norman's original cottage into a substantial stone and wood lodge for guests and business associates. Then Bartlett did something that would shape the land for the next century. In 1911, he purchased 15 Rocky Mountain elk and arranged for their transport from out of state. The native elk of northern New Mexico, the Miriam's subspecies, had been hunted to complete extinction by the early 1900s. Bartlett brought them back. Not the same subspecies, which was gone forever, but Rocky Mountain elk that could fill the same ecological niche. The state of New Mexico imported an additional 12 elk from Colorado around the same time. From those 27 animals, the elk population of northeastern New Mexico would eventually grow to many thousands. Today, the Valle Vidal unit of the Carson National Forest, which borders Vermejo, supports one of the largest elk herds in the Southwest, roughly 2,500 animals. Those elk exist because a grain speculator decided more than a century ago that his private mountain retreat ought to have game in it. Bartlett also stocked the ranch's lakes with trout, built a power plant, and expanded the property to 300,000 acres. He did not move his official residence to Vermejo until July of 1910, but his sons had lived there continuously from 1903. Norman managed the ranch. William Jr. breathed the air. Whether the air actually helped is unclear. What is documented is that William Jr. lived at Vermejo in a cottage designed for his comfort, and that Bartlett poured money into the place with the intensity of a man trying to purchase his son's survival. Then Bartlett died at the ranch in 1918. He was 68. And within 2 years, both of his sons were dead as well, Norman and William Jr., leaving no direct heirs to manage the property they had barely begun to develop. The ranch was orphaned. What followed was a scramble. A syndicate of businessmen from New York, St. Louis, and Chicago took an option to buy the property and organized something called the Vermejo Park Club, selling memberships to men like Tex Austin, the rodeo promoter, and Billy Mitchell, the Army Air Service general. A member of the Frederick Guest family, British aristocrats with American connections, shot an elk on the property that was, at the time, the 9th largest ever recorded. That rack ended up on display at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, where it sits to this day. But the syndicate could not raise the $1.8 million asking price, and the club was disbanded. In 1926, the property was purchased by Harry Chandler, publisher of the Los Angeles Times, and one of the most powerful men in Southern California. Chandler and his investors, Frank Garbutt and Bernal Diaz among them, reopened the ranch as a new Vermejo Park Club this time on a grander scale. Membership was by invitation only. The lifetime fee was $5,000. The club's literature described its membership as carefully selected from men worth knowing, who have been prompted to give it countenance by their sympathy with its ideals and their confidence in its purpose. Among those men worth knowing, Cecil B. DeMille, Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, Will Rogers, Harvey Firestone, Will Hayes, the man who would soon impose the production code on Hollywood, Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, and Herbert Hoover, who was elected President of the United States 2 years after the club opened. Picture it. The late 1920s, and some of the wealthiest and most famous people in America are riding horses through the Sangre de Cristos, fishing for trout in lakes stocked by a dead grain speculator, sleeping in a stone mansion designed by Frank Lloyd Wright's mentor, on land that had been a Mexican land grant, then a fur trapper's empire, then a British investment, then a squatter settlement, and was now a playground. The elk they hunted descended from 15 animals shipped in from the north. The Italian marble in the house they dined in had been quarried an ocean away. The workers who maintained the property were, in many cases, the same people, or their children, whom Bartlett had evicted from the river bottoms 20 years earlier. The Vermejo Club was, in every sense, a fantasy built on layers of other people's losses. The fantasy lasted about a decade. The Depression killed it. By the late 1930s, the Vermejo Club was disbanded, and the ranch was leased out for cattle operations. The big houses sat quietly, the elk grazed, the trout held in the lakes, and the land waited. While all of this was happening on the surface, the mansions, the celebrities, the $5,000 memberships, something far more violent was taking place beneath it. The coal seams that ran under the lower elevations of Vermejo and the surrounding country had been known since the 1860s, when a homesteader named John Barclay Dawson found lumps of coal on his ranch along the Vermejo River and started burning them in his stove instead of wood. His neighbor thought he was crazy until they tried it. By the 1880s, commercial mining had begun. The Raton Coal and Coking Company started operations at a place called Blossburg in Dillon Canyon in 1881 in conjunction with the Santa Fe Railroad. More camps followed. Brilliant, half a mile south. Gardner, 3 miles southwest of Raton. Swastika, wedged between Blossburg and Brilliant. And Kohler, 22 miles southwest of Raton, deeper into the ranch. These were company towns full of immigrant workers, Italians, Greeks, Germans, Austrians, who had come to dig coal out of the Sangre de Cristos for the railroads and the smelters. The St. Louis, Rocky Mountain, and Pacific Company ran rail lines into the canyons to haul out the coal. At their peak, the camps supported hundreds of families, with houses built in tight rows against the canyon walls. Today, Blossburg has one surviving dwelling and a few crumbling adobe walls. Kohler is an arrangement of collapsing wooden shacks whose walls still carry faint traces of paint. The floods that periodically scour Dillon Canyon have reduced most of the other structures to foundations. The most important mine was at Dawson, just downstream along the Vermejo River. In 1901, Dawson's ranch was sold to the Dawson Fuel Company for $400,000. Phelps Dodge took over in 1906 and turned Dawson into the largest company-owned town in the Southwest, a community with stores, schools, churches, a hospital, a baseball team, and homes for thousands of families. At its peak, Dawson was a genuine town with an Italian neighborhood and a Greek neighborhood and a Mexican neighborhood, and children who grew up not thinking much about the fact that their fathers spent every day a mile underground. On October 22, 1913, at 3:10 in the afternoon, a dynamite charge in mine number 2 ignited coal dust, and the mine exploded. 100-foot flame shot out of the entrance. The earth shook. Of the 286 men in the mine that day, 263 died. Only 23 came out alive. One of them, a Greek miner named George Mavroidis, watched 16 men around him die before he lost consciousness and was carried out the next morning. Of the dead, 146 were Italian, 36 were Greek. Phelps Dodge paid each widow $1,000 and each child of a dead miner $200. 2 rescue workers also died. It was the second deadliest coal mining disaster in American history. The mines stayed open. New miners came. And on February 8, 1923, not quite 10 years later, a mine car in Stag Canyon Mine No. 1 jumped its track, knocked down timbers, and the electric trolley cable sent sparks into coal dust. Another explosion. This time, 120 men died. Many of them were the sons and brothers and cousins of the men who had died in 1913. Today, the Dawson Cemetery sits on a hillside at the end of 5 miles of hard-packed red dirt road running along the Vermejo River. There is nothing else there. The town was razed and sold off after Phelps Dodge closed the mines in 1950. But the cemetery remains. Nearly 400 identical white iron crosses, some with names, some without, standing in rows on the wind-swept ground. Some sections are dedicated to the 1913 dead, others to the 1923 dead. The only sound is wind and birds. Every 2 years, descendants of the miners from across the country make a pilgrimage back, hang banners with their family names, and share photographs of the grandparents and great-grandparents they never knew. Those crosses stand on land that is now part of the Vermejo Park Ranch. The men who are buried there worked within earshot of the lodges where Harvey Firestone and Herbert Hoover fished for trout. That fact is never stated on any historical marker, because there are no historical markers, just the crosses and the wind and the red dirt road. After the Vermejo Club folded in the late 1930s, the ranch drifted. Cattle grazed. Nobody built anything. The buildings aged. It took a Texas oil man named W.J. Gourley to bring the place back to life. Starting in 1945, Gourley began buying property in the Vermejo area and eventually expanded the ranch to 480,000 acres. He was a Fort Worth businessman who saw the same thing Bartlett and Chandler had seen, a private wilderness big enough to get lost in, and he used it for both recreation and cattle ranching. Gourley bought several hundred elk from Yellowstone National Park at $5 a head to bolster the herd Bartlett had started. He bred and raised wild turkeys to increase the bird population. He built Shuri Lodge in the high country circa 1958 for hunting guests. On December 23, 1955, the original Middle Guest House, the one Silsby had designed for Norman Bartlett, the lodge that had been the center of the Vermejo Club's social life, burned to the ground. Gourley didn't rebuild it. Instead, he renovated the old stables into a social and dining area, a conversion that remains in use today. Gourley died of a heart attack in August 1970. He was 81 years old. For 3 years, the ranch sat in his widow's possession while potential buyers circled. The asking price was $26.5 million. The National Park Service was interested. The Forest Service made inquiries. The state of New Mexico considered buying it. 480,000 acres of some of the most spectacular mountain wilderness in the Southwest, for what worked out to about $55 an acre. New Mexico passed. It is one of those decisions that people in the state's conservation community still talk about, half a century later, with the particular bitterness reserved for deals that were there and were not taken. In 1973, the Pennzoil Corporation purchased Vermejo Park Ranch through a subsidiary called the Vermejo Park Corporation. Pennzoil was an oil company, and they had their eyes on what was underground. They ran surveys and drilled test wells, hoping to find significant fossil fuel deposits on the property. The initial results were disappointing, but Pennzoil made 2 moves that reshaped the ranch's geography. First, in 1982, they donated 100,000 acres of the property, a spectacular mountain basin called the Valle Vidal, Spanish for Valley of Life, to the U.S. Forest Service, to be added to the Carson National Forest. The donation came with a tax credit of approximately $26 million, which essentially allowed Pennzoil to recoup what they had paid for the entire ranch. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary piece of financial engineering. Buy a ranch for $26.5 million, donate a portion of it, write off $26 million, and keep the rest. The Valle Vidal, one of the most pristine mountain basins in the southern Rockies, a place of alpine meadows and old-growth spruce and elk calving grounds, became public land essentially for free, and Pennzoil got Vermejo essentially for free. Second, Pennzoil purchased 190,000 acres from the Kaiser Steel Company, land that included the old York Canyon coal mining operations southwest of Raton, and added it to Vermejo, expanding the ranch to nearly 588,000 acres. Pennzoil continued cattle ranching, expanded guest facilities, and in 1990 to 91 built a new main lodge on the stone foundations of Norman Bartlett's cottage, the one that had burned in 1955. The new lodge was manufactured in British Columbia and shipped in pieces to New Mexico, where it was assembled between the Casa Minor and the Casa Grande like a prefabricated national park lodge dropped into the gap between two Mission Revival mansions. Pennzoil held Vermejo for 23 years. Then, in 1996, they sold it to a man who had spent his entire adult life accumulating things that other people said were impossible to hold on to. Ted Turner was 57 years old in 1996, the same age, almost to the year, that Lucien Maxwell had been when he died penniless at Fort Sumner 121 years earlier. Turner had already founded CNN, built Turner Broadcasting into a cable empire, married and divorced Jane Fonda, won the America's Cup, owned the Atlanta Braves, and given $1 billion to the United Nations. He had also been buying ranches since the mid-1980s, starting with the Flying D in Montana, and he was well on his way to becoming one of the largest private landowners in the country. The origin story, as he liked to tell it, was simple. As a boy in Savannah, Georgia, he had been turned in to the police for shooting a squirrel on a neighbor's property with a BB gun. A judge fined him. Turner's response, which he stated many times over the decades with the assurance of a man who had made it come true, was, "I decided I was going to make a lot of money so I could buy my own damn land." He bought Vermejo from Pennzoil, though the exact purchase price has never been publicly confirmed. He did not, however, buy the mineral rights. Pennzoil retained those and later sold them to El Paso Natural Gas. This meant that Turner owned the surface, every acre of grass and timber and mountain, while someone else owned what was underneath. By 2011, there were 970 natural gas wells on the property, 840 of them in New Mexico and 130 in Colorado, pumping coal-bed methane out of the same seams that had killed 383 miners at Dawson a century earlier. Turner negotiated strict environmental controls for the extraction, but the wells remained. Bison grazed above them. Because that was the first thing Turner did. He sold the cattle. Every cow on the ranch was removed. In their place, he brought bison. Not just any bison, though. When Turner took possession of Vermejo, he discovered that the ranch was already home to a small, largely forgotten herd known as the Castle Rock herd, named for a rock formation on the property that was thought to have been there since the 1920s. Genetic testing would later reveal something remarkable. The Castle Rock herd carried a representation of 4 of the 6 foundational herds from which all present-day North American bison descend. Those 6 original remnant herds were all that survived the slaughter of the 19th century, when bison were reduced from tens of millions to fewer than 1,000 animals. Most modern bison carry cattle DNA, the result of intentional crossbreeding experiments in the 1800s, when ranchers tried to create hybrid beef animals. The Castle Rock herd tested clean, no cattle genetics. They were, in a sense, more purely bison than almost any other herd on the continent. Turner built his operation around that herd and expanded it across all of his ranches, eventually about 2 million acres spread across New Mexico, Montana, Nebraska, Kansas, and South Dakota. he grew a bison herd of approximately 45,000 head, making him the largest private bison owner in the world. The meat supplied his Ted's Montana Grill restaurant chain. But the scale of what Turner was doing at Vermejo went beyond bison. In 1997, he created the Turner Endangered Species Fund. At Vermejo, working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the fund began restoring the black-footed ferret, an animal that had been declared extinct in 1979 before a tiny remnant population was found in Wyoming. In 2008, ferrets were permanently reintroduced to their native New Mexico habitat on the ranch. To support them, Turner's team expanded prairie dog colonies across more than 8,000 acres, prairie dogs being the ferret's only food source and its primary shelter. The ranch also became a site for restoring the native Rio Grande cutthroat trout to 120 miles of stream habitat. A University of Wyoming graduate student, during a 3-year botanical survey of the property, documented over 1,000 different vascular plant species, including 2 that were entirely new to science. A previously unknown phlox found above timberline in the alpine scree, which was named the Vermejo phlox, and a new penstemon near State Line Peak. The irony of Vermejo under Turner was layered and inescapable. Here was a man who had made his fortune in media, in the intangible world of signals and screens, spending hundreds of millions to undo more than a century of damage done by men who had made their fortunes in tangible things: grain, cattle, coal, oil. Bartlett had evicted the squatters, introduced non-native elk, and built a mansion in the wilderness. Chandler and his club had treated the land as a backdrop for wealthy leisure. Gourley had run cattle. Pennzoil had punched wells. Each owner had extracted what they wanted and left the land diminished in some way. Turner's project was, explicitly, to reverse all of it, to let the rivers heal, to bring back the native species, to replace cattle with the animal that had been there before any of them. But even Turner could not erase the gas wells because he did not own what was underneath. And even Turner could not undo the fact that the elk he was now managing were the descendants of Bartlett's 15 transplants, not the native Miriam's elk that had evolved there. With the cattle gone, the elk population had ballooned into the ecological vacuum, and the animals had overgrazed the riparian corridors until stretches of the Vermejo River were cut into deep, eroding gashes. Turner's ranch managers erected high fence exclusion zones along the riverbanks, mile by mile, moving upstream to let the vegetation recover. Where the fences had been up for a few years, willows and grasses returned, the banks stabilized, and the water cleared. Where they had not, the erosion continued. It was the kind of patient, expensive, unglamorous work that makes no headlines and takes decades to complete. The land was not going back to what it had been before the Maxwell Grant. It was becoming something new, again, in the image of its latest owner. Turner spent years and millions renovating Casa Grande, Bartlett's stone mansion, into a luxury guest estate. The renovation took nearly 4 years, from 2012 to 2016, and was designed to retain the original Silsby architecture, the ballroom, the conservatory, the mahogany carvings. When it reopened, Casa Grande became the crown jewel of what Turner was calling a reserve, a property that operated as part luxury ranch vacation, part conservation laboratory, part living museum of the American West. A night in the mansion ran $18,000 in peak season. Guests arrived by private jet at a nearby airstrip and were driven up to the ranch through a gate marked with a forged metal silhouette of an elk head. The property won awards. Travel Plus Leisure named it the best resort hotel in the West in 2023. The conservation work attracted researchers, documentary crews, and collaborators from federal agencies. Turner, characteristically, spoke of Vermejo with both bluntness and something approaching awe. We've been told that it's the largest piece of contiguous private land in the United States under one ownership, he said. It was, and it was his, and he had spent 3 decades trying to heal it. In 2018, Turner revealed that he had been diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, a progressive brain disease. Over the following years, he withdrew from public life. His 5 children and Turner Enterprises continued to manage the ranches. Conservation easements were placed on some properties. The 363,000-acre Armendaris Ranch in south-central New Mexico received one of the largest permanent easements in the nation's history in 2022. Turner Enterprises stated that the ranch holdings would continue to be protected, limiting future development and parcelation. On May 6, 2026, Ted Turner died at his home near Tallahassee, Florida. He was 87 years old. The question that now hangs over Vermejo is the same question that has hung over it for 185 years. What happens next? Every previous answer has surprised. A fur trapper's empire became a foreign investment. A foreign investment became a grain speculator's sanatorium. A sanatorium became a Hollywood playground. A playground became a cattle ranch. A cattle ranch became an oil company's tax strategy. A tax strategy became a billionaire's conservation project. Each transition seemed, at the time, like the definitive use of the land. None of them lasted more than a generation or two. The Turner family has signaled its intent to protect the property, and the legal structures around the other Turner ranches, the easements, the foundations, the institute partnerships, suggest a framework for doing so. But Vermejo has no conservation easement on record. It is private land, and it has changed hands 8 times since 1870. You can stand at the main gate of Vermejo Park Ranch today, the one with the elk head silhouette in forged metal, and for the first mile or so, the view is unremarkable. Grassland, sky, the kind of New Mexico cloudscape that makes you think the whole ceiling of the world is moving. Then the road turns and the valley opens, and you are looking at a landscape so vast and so green and so empty of human presence that it is difficult to process as real estate. It is simply earth. In the distance, the Sangre de Cristos carry snow on their peaks, and somewhere up there, above timberline, a flower that did not have a name until a few years ago is blooming in the scree. Downstream along the Vermejo River, past the stone mansions and the prefabricated lodge, and the ghost towns where nothing stands but crumbling adobe and the faint lines of vanished streets, the cemetery at Dawson holds its silence. The white iron crosses, one for each miner, 263 from October 1913, 120 from February 1923, stand in rows on the hillside, some with names, some without, tilting slightly in the wind that never stops in that part of the country. No one owns those men. The land they died under has been sold and resold and donated and expanded and contracted and renamed so many times that the paper trail would fill a room. But the crosses don't move. They have been there through the Vermejo Club and the cattle years and Pennzoil and Ted Turner and whatever comes next. 5 miles of red dirt road, and then the river, and then the crosses, and then the wind.